Just say no to mushing. The 2019 Iditarod is done, but the pain of the Iditarod lifestyle is never over for the dogs. Tourists continue to flock to Alaska to mush for fun. They should see what PETA's undercover investigators saw. To mush, it's a crystal clear case of cruelty. That's next on the PETA Podcast. Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo, your host for this behind-the-scenes look at PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. Here we talk to the key players at PETA and the movement and ask them about how animal rights change their lives and how they stay motivated to make the world a better place for the animals. On today's episode, a groundbreaking undercover investigation of how Iditarod dogs are treated.
No one's ever really peeked behind this curtain. An industry that, if there ever is a concerned handler who goes public with any claims, they really circle the wagons very quickly and have each other's backs and deny any sort of misconduct. But our eyewitness was there filming, and he was getting a really close look at what happens there behind the scenes.
Colin Henstock, PETA investigation specialist, talks about what the investigators saw. Next on the PETA Podcast. But first, thanks again for joining us here at the PETA Podcast. This is episode 63 in our second season of shows. Please share a link with friends. Let them know the animals have a voice on the PETA Podcast. And if you've just found us, welcome. And keep binging. There's lots to listen to on the PETA Podcast. Horse racing season's Triple Crown is coming up, and PETA has helped usher in a change at Santa Anita and quite possibly nationwide to end cruelty to horses. Listen to episodes 60 and 59. And Canada's barbaric seal slaughter has begun. Take action at PETA.og. And now to our episode. The Iditarod is over, but there's still tourists who go to Alaska and insist on mushing for fun. But it's no fun run for the dogs. Here's PETA's Colin Henstock on the investigation that exposes just how poorly the Husky dogs are cared for on the PETA Podcast.
The Iditarod is really the pinnacle of this industry that PETA's had on their radar for ages. And we wanted to take a look behind the scenes at what happens at the kennels of some of the larger names in this sport, or so-called sport. Our eyewitness worked at Team Baker Kennel and at Iditarod Kennel, which is owned by Mitch Seaveys. Both of those are very well-known names in the kennel mushing business.
Yeah, I mean, when you say Seaveys, that's sort of like when you mention Gordie Howe's name in hockey or something like that.
That's right.
Or I'm trying to think of a name in baseball. Barry Bonds had his father, Bobby Bonds, or Ken Griffey. I mean, those are like legacy names. So Seaveys, that establishes that you were dealing at the top level.
That's right. Mitch Seaveys has won the Iditarod 3 times, and our eyewitness saw that he had around 150 dogs chained to these plastic, uninsulated barrels 24/7. Some of the dogs had paced around the perimeter of their chain so much that their feet were actually bleeding. And Seaveys actually had quite a few staff members there, some of whom our eyewitness saw striking dogs to force them to line up in front of sleds. Others bragged about kicking dogs as well. So it's quite a large operation, and there was quite a bit happening there that we were concerned about.
All right, let's take it one at a time now. How many dogs did Seaveys have up there total?
Seaveys had 150 dogs approximately.
And of these 150 dogs, how many actually go out to actually run the Iditarod? Were these, and this was all done before the actual race. How many of these 150 dogs actually participated?
Well, there are about 14 dogs who were used in the Iditarod, but that actually brings up kind of an important separate topic. A lot of these dogs who were at this kennel were used for tours. Tourists would come and they would take dogs out and run for the day and then haul the dogs back to the kennel at the end of their rides. So that's something we also wanted to make people aware of, is that the tourist industry is a major component of this dog mushing industry.
So regardless of whether or not they're athletes, it doesn't mean anything. I mean, they're still abused. They're still exploited by the tourism industry, really. Huh?
That's right. I mean, they were taken out in the morning and run with the tourists. The tourists would take pictures with them and pet them and everything. And right after that, they were put back in the truck, hauled back to the yard, chained right back up.
You mean like tourists, like, Mr. and Mrs. Joe tourists, they go up to Alaska and say, I've heard about the Iditarod. I can have a real mushing experience. They pay X number of dollars. They go outside of their hotel room and they truck the dogs over to them and they start mushing around for an hour or two.
Yeah, they would meet them up outside of the kennel. They would, go to another location where they would start the tour. So, the tourists weren't around to see, what these dogs were confined to for 24 hours a day when they weren't being trucked out for tours.
Yeah. So they look like, here's some dogs. They're going to take us for a little. Do they actually race them like they're in a sort of mini Iditarod, or do they just go out for a leisurely stroll?
I believe it's more of just a leisurely type of thing. And it really does give a misleading picture of what this industry actually is and what happens behind the scenes.
And then after their little tourist thing is done, the tourists say goodbye. They pay the money, and then the dogs go back in the truck and then back into their really despicable kind of life, huh?
Yeah, straight back to the same conditions.
So tourists, once they know, are they shocked, or do they just live in this sort of oblivious state as tourists?
Well, that's really why we think this investigation is so important. I mean, it's really groundbreaking in the fact that no one's ever really peeked behind this curtain. It's an industry that, if there ever is a concerned handler who goes public with any claims, they really circle the wagons very quickly and have each other's backs and deny any sort of misconduct. But our eyewitness was there filming, and during the course of doing his duties, which were remove feces from yards and provide food, things like that, he was getting a really close look at what happens there behind the scenes.
And so tourists, when they pay and subsidize this kind of business, they're just looking for fun, these tourists. If they knew what was going on, they'd be horrified.
I do believe that. I think, you could be a dog lover and go out to one of these excursions and spend some time and, fall in love with these dogs. But you really do need to be aware of what happens when you're not around and what these lives are like, back at the kennels where they're spending the majority of their time.
And what does it cost to take these dogs out?
I know that it's not a cheap thing to do for these tourists.
People know now that this is an ongoing thing. The Iditarod's over, but the conditions for the dogs continue in this tourism trade. What kind of dogs are we talking about here? Just what kind of dogs are the mushers?
These are Alaskan Huskies. And, a common refrain that we've heard and that our eyewitness was told was that these are working dogs who need to be in these kind of conditions. But it's really not true. I mean, these dogs have the same requirements that any other dog would have. They want to be comfortable. They have every sort of requirement that other dogs do, and they feel just as much pain and suffering when they're exposed to these conditions as any other dog breed would.
And the dogs all have names. I mean, you have on the PETA.org website, there are dogs like Snickers and Birch and Captain. And if people go to PETA.org, they can see pictures of Snickers, Birch, and Captain. They're all suffering there in Alaska, but they're actually given names just like a normal pet would, but they're not treated like normal pets.
Exactly. And Snickers is actually a very important dog to this investigation. Snickers was John Baker's lead dog when he won the Iditarod in 2011. And you can actually see pictures of Baker with Snickers right at the finish line when he's celebrating and she has flowers around her neck, and it's such a jubilant scene. Our eyewitness saw her 7 years later, and she was chained up in really extreme temperatures, below zero wind chills, next to the sea that had frozen over. She had no shelter whatsoever until our eyewitness built one for her. And she was suffering from really painful arthritis, and she limped for it really severely. So that is just kind of a perfect picture of what these dogs, who are, the most important dogs to these Iditarod champions, this is what they'll be relegated to at the end of their lives. And these are the useful dogs to them. So, I mean, that's a perfect encapsulation of this industry.
Yeah, I mean, to see the pictures, it's really heartbreaking because these are, as you put it, these are the champions. These are the winners. They win, and they're treated like, oh my goodness. I mean, some of the pictures, the videos, was it hard to get the videos, or is it so like constant, the kind of distress that these dogs are under?
Well, there's no shortage of suffering at these kennels. I mean, the conditions just walking through Baker's kennel, which is in Kotzebue, Alaska, our eyewitness immediately saw some of the shelters were tipped over on their side, and dogs just had to just kind of squat inside them. One dog's shelter was so dilapidated that the floor had fallen out, and the dog was just forced to sleep in the snow outside of the little wooden box that was intended as a shelter there. Any animal lover, if they could see the conditions that these dogs are confined to 24/7 for the vast majority of their lives, they would rightly be appalled at what they were seeing.
The dogs don't get to stay inside. They don't get to come in at all anywhere. But in for them is to come into a dilapidated box. I'm looking at a picture now, and it just looks like an old carton with barely some shelter for a dog. But the dog prefers to be outside, out on the snow, because the box is so lousy.
True, yeah. And then, once the dogs were taken out on training runs, you had situations where dogs who were running, if they fell, they would be dragged for a period of time. PETA's eyewitness was in a Jeep with John Baker as the Jeep was going along an icy road with a team of dogs attached to the front of it, pulling along in front of the Jeep. And one dog fell. Baker allowed the dog to be dragged on an icy road for about 500 feet before braking the Jeep and allowing the dog to get up. And his rationale was that this would teach a dog to reconsider slowing down. That as a training method.
On the website, it's written that it's better to have a dead dog than a dog who slows down the team. If people considered the cruelty that's built in there, you wouldn't want to support any mushers. You wouldn't want to support the Iditarod, and you wouldn't certainly want to support the tourism, which is built around the legend of the Iditarod.
This is a lot of money for these mushers. John Baker has won nearly $603,000 just from the Iditarod. Mitch Seavey has won over $813,000 just for the Iditarod. So, there's a lot of money at stake, and naturally that leads to animals suffering as a result.
And looking at these pictures of injuries, there's you got not just the way they're treated, like one dog is struck in the face. You've got another dog who's, being dragged as a puppy, a paralyzed puppy, left to drag herself through the snow. I mean, one example after the other. I mean, who's out there caring for these animals? Is it the idea that it's, hey, look, this is a Darwinian process and let it's a survival of the fittest kind of thing?
Well, I think that's probably an image that they would use in their defense, that there's no one around to care for these dogs, and so they have to vet the dogs themselves. But that's really actually not the case as well, too. Birch, the puppy who suffered a severe spinal cord injury, was briefly taken inside the house and then was just chained back outside for weeks while she struggled to move around. Our observer actually offered to take her for vetting multiple times and asked to adopt her as well. That was denied by Baker and Keith. Baker actually said that anyone who saw the dog would think that they're being real hard on them. So the image of dogs who, are tough individuals out in the wild with these tough people, it's not exactly the case that we found. There even offers to take these dogs to be treated to a better life and rehabilitation were also denied.
So this isn't a matter of being tough and being strong and, doing it for the sport. This is just an out-and-out matter of cruelty.
Absolutely. I mean, it's the sport really sells itself on this man versus nature kind of image and this very Alaskan image. And unfortunately, that industry, it thrives off of this image whenever there are plenty of other options for that kind of interest story in Alaska. There's no need to confine dogs in these conditions and run them for hundreds of miles when they're exhausted and injured, all to just cultivate what you think the general public wants to see out of an Alaskan sport.
I'm looking through the pictures and the stories, and the mushers, the people who really depend on these dogs, the attitude for the dog is pretty much F the dog, right? It's like they hate the dogs, which is hard to understand if you're a dog lover.
Exactly. That's referring to Captain. Captain is allegedly the son of one of Seaveys' champion dogs named Kosher. And Captain was actually very scared of people and would run circles around the plastic barrel that he was chained to the extent that his collar rubbing on his neck was causing wounds to open up on the neck. They were actually infected as well. Instead of taking him to a veterinarian, which in the case of Seaveys' kennel, there was a veterinarian about half an hour away by car, they briefly put him in a pen, and where a worker pulled pieces of skin off of his wounds and squeezed pus out of the wounds with his bare hands, and then sprayed a fungicide right into the open wounds. And there was frustration there on the part of the kennel manager. His name's Ryan Santiago. He's another Iditarod musher with this dog for simply being scared of the people who had confined him to these conditions and running, constantly around his house. So the blame was on the dog rather than on themselves for confining this dog in a situation where the dog would be injured.
Who's there to care for them? I mean, they don't let them see vets. How do the dogs survive this?
They suffer through it, unfortunately. I mean, they mend and, however they can mend themselves, and the day that they're not profitable, then they'll be disposed of or, just relegated like Snickers was to just a dirty patch of snow to live out the rest of their life there. It's a very tough, cruel life for a dog.
the dogs who are actually mushers in the race, I mean, they don't come back all pristine and healthy. Some are really beaten up by the race versus the others who are just neglected and go out for tourist runs. But if you are a dog who actually went to the Iditarod, and you're a pretty worn out dog.
Absolutely. And Catherine Keith, who is a co-owner of Team Baker Kennel, where our observer was employed, two of her dogs have died in recent Iditarod races from aspiration pneumonia, which is when a dog is vomiting while running and inhaling the vomit. And it's actually a common killer of dogs during the Iditarod. Mitch Seaveys' lead dog, Pilot, he's a dog that the kennel claims is the dog who makes Mitch Seavey great. He suffered the same injury in the 2018 and 2019 Iditarod races. He suffered a leg injury. After the injury in the 2019 Iditarod, he was dropped and then shipped back to the kennel. And once he arrived at the kennel, the workers just put him back on a chain and didn't even examine him. He was just kind of put right back on the same house where he spent his life. And that was life for him.
And this is Pilot?
That's Pilot.
Wow. It's so sad to see the pictures. Once again, the pictures and the report, it's at PETA.org, the website, and look up Iditarod. And, you know, I've done a number of these podcast interviews with people about the Iditarod, but this really is a groundbreaking investigation. And when I hear people talk about the kennels, those little plastic crates with a little bit of straw on the bed, and when I hear people talk about them in conversation or in an interview, that's one thing. But to see the crates lined up and see dog after dog after dog, and to see the conditions that they're asked to live for, and that really is, from what I see from the investigation, those are the dogs who are treated well. Those are kind of the first class dogs who are chained to these little crates. Because the other dogs who aren't doing well are the dogs who don't get the plastic crates. They get the old wooden dilapidated boxes. Now, that's like, you know, it's like I said, it's heartbreaking to see this investigation.
It really is.
And so the Iditarod ran, it's over. And what do you want now for this investigation to tell people who were either ardent supporters of the race, either as sponsors or as fans? What good can this investigation do now?
Well, all of this pain and suffering will continue as long as the Iditarod has race sponsors, corporations that will continue to fund the race. So we are asking everyone to visit PETA.org, look at the investigation feature, and to join us in encouraging Chrysler, Millennium Hotels, and Alaskan Airlines to drop their sponsorship of the race. And we remind everyone to never take part in any Alaskan tour excursion that involves dog sled mushing.
And what would the effect of the companies dropping their endorsement do? Because they're really the financial lifeblood, right? The sponsorship. If that money were to go away, one might say, well, what's going to be the condition of the dogs then? Then the dogs are really in trouble without this financial sponsorship.
Well, I think it would be kind of a dwindling of the industry. And, I don't think it would be a finger snap and this all goes away by any means. But I do think that as long as this money is coming in, and it is actually dwindling, we've seen Wells Fargo, we've seen Jack Daniels drop their sponsorship of the race. Whenever it dwindles down enough that the race ends, the industry itself will dwindle to nothing as well too. And we would hope that these mushers actually do take the initiative to place dogs in reputable, either rescues or, good private homes where these dogs can actually live out their lives the way a dog should.
I mean, really, these husky dogs are no different than the kind of husky dog you might get from an animal shelter, or a husky dog that you might adopt, heaven forbid, from a breeder. But I mean, if you got a purebred husky dog, it would be no different from the dogs that they'd see in these investigations, right?
Any dog needs exercise and needs attention and needs adequate stimulation. These dogs require the same thing that other, high energy breeds do, but that it doesn't mean to say that, they could never be placed in an adoptive home. That's just simply that the industry wants to tout as an excuse for not actually, for confining dogs in these kind of conditions and treating them the way that they do.
I mean, these dogs aren't like wolves or something, or wild animals. That's what the Iditarod folks want you to believe, because they're out there mushing and working. They're just ordinary working dogs. Like, say, look, I have a border collie, or had my favorite border collie, Ross, the border collie. We had to put down about a little more than a year ago, and he was just a fabulous athlete. He was quick. He would throw the frisbee and he would leap out there like he was a wide receiver, sort of like, like the Odell Beckham Jr. He was like, he would like race out there. He was great. And the best, I mean, sometimes you throw a frisbee at a dog and the dog just sort of collapses and, he just doesn't know what to do with the frisbee. But this guy was instinctive. He knew he was a gifted athlete, and he had cancer and we had to put him down. But, I know that there are Alaskan husky dogs who are gifted athletes too. I mean, I know that there's that difference. And yet, basically, they can be just as domesticated as the next dog. They're not some wild dog. As easily as you can as these Iditarod folks chain up a dog, in these plastic kennels, they could as easily be taken into a home and petted and, and be a companion animal for life in someone's living home. Absolutely. The only way I can imagine these guys up there in the Iditarod get away with treatment of the animals like this is they make the claim that these animals are these savage, athletic, wilderness dogs, right?
Right. And in the right home, they would thrive. And they clearly do not thrive living their lives at the end of a chain whenever they're not being forced to run hundreds of miles.
Colin, I really appreciate your time, and I think that this investigation is really it's groundbreaking because, as you say, it's never been done. No one's ever seen what these dogs are, what they go through. But even if the Iditarod is over, people can still, protest if they go up to Alaska and they participate in these tourist sort of. Because no matter what it looks like a little Sunday run for the dogs, it's not a Sunday run for the dogs when they go back to the kennels.
We encourage everyone to check out the footage for themselves at PETA.org and to join us in boycotting this cruel industry and encouraging the sponsors of the Iditarod to drop their sponsorships.
This wasn't your first investigation, right?
No, this is not. I here at PETA, I talk with whistleblowers who contact us from agricultural industries, from the pet trade industry, and I've been a part of several investigations in my 5.5 years here. But this is one I feel is especially important, and I'm very glad that it's out there for the general public to get a look at what's actually happening in this industry.
What gives you hope, or what keeps you from getting too emotional when you see how these dogs are treated, or these animals, because you deal not just with dogs but other animals. When you see the investigators' raw footage come back in different investigations, how do you deal with that as a person, and how does that make you a stronger animal rights activist?
There needs to be a channeling away from sadness and distress over the individual animal, and determination to get this story out to the world and to show the world what these animals are going through this very moment. And just know that everything that is exposed by our field observers is one step closer to actually ending these industries.
All right. Colin Henstock, thank you very much for your time, and thanks for being on the PETA Podcast.
Thank you, Emil.
Colin Henstock, PETA investigation specialist, on the groundbreaking expose of how husky dogs are cared for even after the Iditarod. You can see pictures of the investigation at PETA.org and take action. Don't be a tourist musher, and urge sponsors to stop their support of the Iditarod. Go to PETA.org and take action now. And that's our program. Don't forget, you can contact us at PETA.org. You can find me on Twitter at Emil Amok, that's EMILAMOK, or on AMOK.com. Once again, thank you for listening. Check out all our episodes on Apple Podcasts, where you can rate and review the show. It helps get the word out about the issues you care about. And don't forget, you can help the animals and PETA, especially if you have Amazon's Alexa. Just say, Alexa, donate to PETA. Our music is provided by CarbonWorks. Check them out on YouTube. Thanks again for listening. Join us next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo.